God, all things are possible. You have demonstrated God-sized possibility here in Greater New Jersey.
I bet you know those questions. The ones that, instead of leaving us contented with a nice clean answer, leave us disquieted by how messy really life can be and how wide open our hearts have to be just to hold those questions. Join me in giving space to that which we cannot ever fully pin down or understand. And as the unanswerable questions swirl all around us, let's make peace with the uncertainty that accompanies them. For friends, uncertainty is a portal to mystery.
Can you hear the cloud of witnesses? Can you hear your loved ones? In this very moment, they're cheering you on. There is not a move that you will make here on earth that they will not respond in the heavenly realm. And there is not a move they will make in the heavenly realm that will not have direct consequences for you here on earth. We are forever entangled.
We ask for your strength and clear-headedness to have the hard yet necessary conversations. Lord, help us to make the hard decisions that break the fabric of comfort and fear, so that everyone we encounter would experience your limitless love equitably. Lord, there is unbound possibility for the United Methodist Church and the Greater New Jersey Conference, but we cannot unlock those possibilities without you.
Am I filled with the spirit of pioneer, ready to reshape, renew, and redefine the very essence of what it means to be a church? Do I wholeheartedly believe that answering this call to a connectional ministry in the United Methodist Church is my true purpose, making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world? My answer is yes.
Friends, God continues to call all of us into ministry. Don't try to outrun God, but praise God that we are fearfully and wonderfully made to move into our assignments and fulfill our purposes. I pray you are one of those who will be moved by the Holy Spirit tonight to answer your call and be a blessing.
Thank you for all that you're doing to pursue God's purpose and possibilities. And may God continue to bless and multiply all of our ministry together. In the name of the one who is our Creator, our Redeemer, and our Sustainer. Amen.
Thank you all so much for being here to learn more about what happened at annual conference and what some of the conversations we had were. Can you all hear me okay? All right, perfect. So as you saw in the video, some of the highlights of what happened and what goes on at conference, we worship a lot together. There's a variety of worship services. Some of them are focused on specific things like ordination. There were 5 people ordained as elders this year and 1 ordained as a deacon. Now, if you've been following our United Methodist denominational news, you might know that there's some unsettledness within our denomination and people talking about leaving and what's called disaffiliation. We're going to talk about some of that, but the fact that there are still incoming new clergy being ordained and commissioned. There were 8 elders commissioned and 1 deacon. And that's sort of like the first step towards full ordination. So there were 9 of them commissioned and then 6 ordained. The fact that even though our conference, not just the conference, the denomination is going through some challenging, fracturing times, new clergy are still hopeful, and coming into the denomination is a positive, hope-filled thing. So that was definitely something to celebrate. And if you know about disaffiliation and why people are disaffiliating, which we'll talk more about, it's about human sexuality and the church's stance on it, whether we are open and affirming and inclusive, so particularly around marriage and ordination rights, whether LGBTQ individuals are allowed to be ordained, and whether clergy are allowed to marry same-sex couples in a United Methodist church, or even whether they're allowed to perform that ceremony or not. Churches believing you can and can't, individuals believing you can and can't, all that fun stuff. What is interesting is while our denomination and while our book of discipline states, and the biggest fighting point in our book of discipline right now is that statement of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. That has been a fight point for 50 plus years. One of the people who was ordained is a fully out lesbian woman who has spoken on the floor of annual conference and said very clearly, I'm gay. My pronouns are she, her, and she did not say that this year at annual conference, but she's open and out. She does not try to hide that. The bishop knows that she's open and out. She was part of the conversations in GNJ when we were trying to have the, what is right, what is faithful, how do we as GNJ embrace our LGBTQ siblings. Bishop invited her to be part of those conversations as a local pastor serving a local church. She's doing extension ministries now, but she was fully ordained at annual conference this year. She was one of the 5 elders. So while our denomination is sort of in turmoil around inclusivity, congregations and annual conferences are continuing to move forward in affirming life-transforming ways that are open. So that's one of the celebrations of things that happen during the services. Ordination is one of them. Setting of the appointments doesn't really happen during a worship service, but setting of appointments means when pastors are appointed to different churches. Those churches and the pairing of the pastor is always read at annual conference. So you have this parade of pastors and churches. The lay member to the annual conference joins the pastor and they walk forward and get a picture with the bishop. That always happens. There's a service of remembrance. There was another bishop that was asked to come and share in a couple of the different things throughout the service, but one of the things that she did was preach. Her name is Bishop Koi Koi. She serves in the Western PA annual conference, and her sermon was powerful. She also did a teaching moment in one of the other days of the conference, and that was also powerful as well. We celebrated the retirements of clergy who are exiting ministry in active service. We had workshops, as well as mission activities. There was a food packing activity that people got to participate in. It was the first time for 3 years that we had gathered in person at annual conference. Everything during COVID, we all know, everything shut down to virtual, but that was annual conference too. This was the very first time that we had been back in person. So there were people who hadn't seen each other for 4 years, and it was astounding how different people looked in just 4 years, especially COVID years. So that's sort of the spirit of annual conference. And if you think back to John Wesley and the beginning of the denomination and what conference was, it was the time for all of the circuit riders to gather together And they would always sing this one song. And I wanted to sing it. I always want to sing it at a conference, but it's silly. It's, "And are we yet alive?" It's not funny. It's serious for them particularly. They would ride horses in rain, sleet, snow. There was like a joke that even if the mail wouldn't go, the Methodist pastors would. It would be like, it's weather fit for only Methodist pastors or something like that. So they would check in to see one another face to face and make sure that they're still alive and well and serving in ministry. And that's kind of what it felt like 4 years later to see each other face to face. So we got to celebrate a lot of ministry together. And even in the midst of some of the heavy stuff that we dealt with, it was all surrounded in prayer and worship and connection. We remember that we as local churches are part of something that is so much bigger than just us in one location. So I want to, as we're about to shift over into some of the heavier, the legislative work that happened and what some of the voting that we discussed and all that, I want you to hold on to the positive as we, and know that it was all surrounded in prayer and worship at the same time. So we're going to talk about a couple. So Beth Crawford, I keep looking over here. So Beth Crawford is our lay member to annual conference from the local church. Many of you know that already, which means she is the balance to my lay or my clergy vote. She is the balance to my clergy. She's lay. So for every clergy person, you have one lay person, and that counts for retired clergy as well, which means then there's also alternate, like at-large lay members that can serve at, district levels or whatever. All of those people come together and we read a whole bunch of legislation prior to the session. Those pieces of legislation are read and presented, debated, questions are asked, and then we vote. Sometimes they're, amended. Sometimes they're friendly amendments, sometimes they're not friendly amendments, and then we vote, and the legislative work becomes the policy of the annual conference moving forward. There's a few different things that we want to specifically highlight, and those are safe sanctuary conversations, affiliation and conference strategic focus and budgeting conversations, camping ministry, disaffiliation, and then where do we go from here? So I'll do a few of them, and then Beth's going to take some of the other ones. So first one I'm going to start with is helps if I can say it, safe sanctuary policies. How many of you are familiar with the major lawsuit of the Boy Scouts of America against, okay, yes. Or it's against the Boy Scouts of America. The Boy Scouts of America then went bankrupt, they folded, and then the churches that hosted or chartered those Boy Scouts then took the lawsuit on themselves, essentially. That dynamic, that happening, made all the people in the conference go, ooh, we need to freshen up. We need to dust off our safe sanctuary policies, our sexual ethics policies, our professional and financial ethics policies, all of the ethics policies that govern clergy and lay people in a local church. All of that needs to be really bolstered for the care of the people who have been hurt, but also for the well-being of the system as well. Because lawsuits they hurt the church financially, but that's not the people hurt. Is if you can avoid that in any way, shape, or form, my goodness, why aren't we? We're the church. We're supposed to avoid, do no harm, do all the good you can, and stay in love with God. But from an insurance perspective, they're also putting some extra pressure on us to make sure we bolster and live out those policies. So it's a both and. We will be having some more in-depth conversation around our local church safe sanctuary policy. We do have one. Does everyone know what a safe sanctuary policy is? Okay, so we see some nods, not all. Okay, a safe sanctuary policy, I should have started with this, is a policy which puts in place expectations for the way we will be in ministry with those who are minors or at-risk populations of elders. So how do we run a children's program? Are there 2 adults in the classroom at every time? What happens when you have an overnight? Can an adult be in the car with a minor, just one-on-one? How much older than the oldest child in the class does a volunteer have to be? How long does the person have to be a part of the church before they can volunteer in children's ministries? Do we do any sort of background checks? How often do you do background checks? Do we do any sort of training? What kind of training? All of that fun stuff goes into a safe sanctuary policy. We have one. It's dated. And the expectations for safe sanctuary policies, which were heightened significantly around the Boy Scouts of America lawsuit and all that, those heightened expectations are not a part of our safe sanctuary policy. So the policy needs to be updated, number 1. And number 2, we all need to get behind it and celebrate it as a way of keeping our people safe, keeping our kids safe. Nobody's trying to be mean or rude or anything. We're all trying to do good things to keep people safe. So that will be coming down the pike. We need to not only change the policy, but then live it out. Okay, so other strategic and conference things. You may or may not, if you read any of the conference news, you may have heard that GNJ, which is Greater New Jersey Annual Conference, and EPA, Eastern Pennsylvania Annual Conference, they both are overseen by the same bishop, Bishop John Scholl. He's 1 year from mandatory retirement, just FYI. I'll get back to that in a minute. So he has been overseeing both conferences for the past couple of years. They are still 2 unique conferences, but they've been looking at different ways of affiliating. So doing some ministry in shared ways. Some of the ways of that shared affiliation, I pulled up some stats on that. Appointment making. It's not that GNJ clergy will get sent to EPA without their wanting to. It's if you want to go to EPA, you can take an appointment in Pennsylvania. Or EPA people can take an appointment in Jersey. So appointment, they actually sit at the same table and have those conversations together. Leadership development, we're doing some classes and courses together. Connectional ministries, like camping ministries, we'll talk about it again in a minute. Urban and ethnic ministries, communications department. Instead of having an EPA communications department and a GNJ, they're doing that together. The database management, if you do any church conference paperwork, you're familiar with ARENA. EPA had no system like that, so they are being onboarded to the ARENA system. They're very happy about that. Conflict resolution and project management, a variety of different aspects of what happens at the conference level. They're trying to affiliate so that they don't duplicate work that is unnecessary to duplicate. What comes into question when you're talking about an affiliation is, will it lead to merger or will it not? Maybe, maybe not. There's some interesting cultural differences about our two conferences. There's cultural differences, there's financial differences. We have very different budget systems and structures, which is interesting. We have very different wellness, health and wellness of our pension systems, the clergy pension systems. Interesting face, yes. Jersey's is actually pretty healthy as far as the pension system and financial backing of it. EPA's is interesting. So affiliation, and some of the questions that come into affiliation are, who's paying for what? So when you're talking about shared resourcing and shared camping ministries programs and or leadership development or communications staffing, who's paying for what staff members? So interestingly, the strategic plan that was put out, it says EPA/GNJ strategic plan on the top of it. It was put out as legislation for both EPA and GNJ as if it was a joint document. EPA voted it down. GNJ referred it to a study commission. So there's some, you can tell just by that, there's some interesting feelings about the affiliation of the two conferences. Who's driving it? And what's the purpose? So I'm just going to leave that there. We will continue to see more and hear more about what that affiliation looks like if it eventually becomes a merger or not. Also the retirement of the bishop. I said he's got one more year left. It's a 10-year plan. So we're going to have a bishop shift in the midst of it as well. Do we adopt a 10-year plan knowing we're about to have a bishop change? So all of those get into the big question. Moving on to one of the other pieces that is impacted by the affiliation, sort of, or at least the affiliation will kind of help through. How many of you are familiar with Camp Aldersgate in northern New Jersey? How many went there? Yes, that's actually one of the places where I first felt my call to ministry. That closed a number of years ago. Is anyone familiar with Mount Misery or Pinelands Center? A couple. Did anybody go there? Okay, we got a couple. Mount Misery or Pinelands Center, the better name. It was actually Mount Misericordia, but everyone called it Mount Misery. Anyway, that camping ministry has been in a budget deficit for a number of years, and they voted to officially close that camp and sell the property this year. So that is the last of the GNJ camping properties. We do not have a camping ministry within GNJ anymore. There is still Next Gen, which is Next Generation Ministries that does a lot of, working with youth programs within the conference. They do an Ignite program, which is an overnight and conference retreat type of our kids go to it. So there is still youth ministry happening within GNJ and campus ministry for college-age students, but there are no camp ministries. EPA has 4. It's big, EPA. Western PA is even bigger. But just in EPA, there's 4, and they are vibrant and vital and doing fabulous ministry. My sister attends, my oldest sister, you know the two, Rachel and Rebecca. Sarah is the oldest. She lives in Allentown, Pennsylvania, or just near there. Her 2 boys have gone to Gretna Glen and love it. She cannot wait until my girls are of age to go to Gretna Glen. So it's not like without hope camping ministry. It's just further away. And they're looking for ways of kind of providing scholarships for GNJ youth to still be able to take part in camping ministries. So that's a sad but still hopeful thing. Disaffiliation. I'm going to pass it to Beth to talk about that. But I'm here to answer any questions if there's anything that she's uncomfortable with answering questions about. You're like, thanks.
LOL. Thanks so much, Pastor Jess. Disaffiliation. Okay, it's a sad subject, even though, we're laughing because it's a thorny, complicated subject, right? It's a sad subject. A couple slightly hopeful things within here. For one, first of all, we voted to approve the disaffiliation of 8 churches in New Jersey. But for context, we have about 500 churches in New Jersey. So 8 is not a lot. Now, there are a lot of conferences where you're talking, 30, 40, 50% of churches might be disaffiliating. And you can see where that is going to cause havoc in their systems. Because, if you're losing a third or half of your congregations, that's going to be a big deal. It's not going to be quite like that in New Jersey. The numbers are just different. Does that mean there won't be a financial impact? Well, there's got to be a financial impact because, as you know, in our connectional system, we all contribute toward the monies that the funds that the conference needs to keep going. We will know by September or October what that financial impact is going to look like, but it's, again, it's not going to be the severity that some of the other conferences are going to see. Another little hopeful piece that's coming out of the disaffiliations is that, God says, I am doing a new thing. Do you not see it? And there are some congregations that are springing up. There's a church called Revive UMC in Central Texas, and I know Pastor Jess knows more about this, so if, Steve, did you have a question? Yes, thank you. Let's start. Yeah, you can add if I miss a big piece. But so the disaffiliation process is there have been churches that have been discerning for a couple of years now, or may have been discerning for a couple of years, whether or not they would like to leave the United Methodist Church because of issues of inclusiveness and how the LGBTQ community is brought into the fold in what ways in the okay.
So it started in 2019.
So yeah, I'll read the verbiage and we'll see if that's helpful. Whereas the General Conference of the United Methodist Church, sitting in official session as a body in 2019, promulgated legislation recorded as paragraph 2553 of the Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church, allowing a local church to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church for reasons of conscience regarding the actions or inactions of the United Methodist Church around human sexuality. So I think that's like kind of the crux of it right there. And that's a good way to put it, the actions or inactions regarding UMC around human sexuality. As you know, as a Big Ten church, our folks are all over the place. And so some people are very happy with the path their church is taking, and for some people it's just not compatible with where they are. Phyllis?
When this all started, it was my understanding that the churches who were leaving were those who would be affirming LGBTQ. And then I started reading about churches in Texas and Florida who were leaving because they were affirming, now we're not going to do it with LGBTQ, we're going to
I
what the
do you want to give? Sure.
Okay, so in 2019, we had the whole big church general conference, and we adopted in the traditional plan, barely. The traditional plan stated that not only were we as a denomination upholding the homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, but they also added legislation and added verbiage to make it even more strict and more traditional, where if clergy were, there were penalties, even for bishops, if they did not bring clergy up on charges. So it was almost like they gave teeth to the Book of Discipline. Now the question is, what happened after that is where we are now. So what happened after that is pretty much nothing. Nobody, well, almost nobody, actually acted on the punishments that were added into the Book of Discipline. Nobody affected the teeth that the traditionalists were hoping to put in. Instead, they essentially said, we're not going to bring people up on charges. We're just not going to do it. And bishop after bishop after bishop publicly stated in their annual conference sessions, don't worry about it. We're not going to enact that. Some of them were because of financial reasons. Finances always undergird things. Not always, but often. Because each of those charges would have gone to trial. Each trial costs like $1 million. And they're like, that's not faithful for us as a church to spend all this money on church trials. No, we can't afford it, number one, and it's not faithful. We're not going to do it. So people continue to marry LGBTQ individuals in their churches. People continued to pursue the ordination process and be ordained. There is an open and out married gay bishop in the Western jurisdiction. I mean, they were trying to give the discipline teeth to cause harm and like clear it out of all yes, ambiguity, and those who were not living it out. That did not happen. So, as a result, the traditionalists who put that legislation into the Book of Discipline said, fine, you're not going to play by our rules, we're leaving. That's when the disaffiliation was allowed, that's when, not that that's when that was allowed, that's when they were like, fine, we will take that option. So the trust clause is a fun part of our Book of Discipline, where every local church and all of its properties, real and financial, are held in trust for the denomination. This building is not ours here in Clinton, it's the denomination's. If we as a local church wanted to leave the United Methodist Church denomination, we could not take the building with us. The people could go, but none of our resources, our building or financial resources, could come with us. So there's churches who want to leave, but they were bound by the trust clause to stay. In 2019, according to paragraph 2553 of the Book of Discipline, which was added in, allowing people for this specific reason to leave. They would waive the trust clause as long as they worked out a financial package, essentially. And what that financial package is covering the pension. So if a local church had a pastor for 50 years, those 50 years of ministry are still going to need to pay for the pension for that pastor. Even if that pastor exits with them, the pension that they built up during their service in the United Methodist Church will still need to be paid for. So there's a pension portion, there's a shared ministry portion from the current and next year. There's a variety of different pieces. It is not cheap for them to buy out and disaffiliate. So these 8 churches that were voted on were given permission to fulfill the items in their exit package. And you were going to say something about that. Sorry, I jumped in there. So that's sort of how we got here. And in order to go through this whole disaffiliation process, it was not an easy process for them. It has taken them at least a year to have these conversations in local churches. There were more at the beginning. I don't know what the original numbers were, but now there are 8 left who may disaffiliate if they finish their package by December 31st. So, sorry. Did that answer your questions? Yes? Did that answer your question? Okay, sorry.
Good. Nope, that's good. That's very helpful. Yeah.
I know there are only 8, it sounds like a small number of congregations.
They're all over the place. A couple of them are larger, but a bunch of them are smaller. Do we have the sizes on there? I think we have the names, but not the sizes. Oh, we have the voting totals. That's right, yeah. So for instance, Bethany UMC in Wayne, they had 329 total ballots. So that's a pretty decent sized church. The next one, Cornerstone Church in Englewood, 22 people voted. Grace Bethel UMC in Leonia, 37 people voted. The Korean Community Church of New Jersey, Englewood, 175 people voted. The First Korean UMC of Cherry Hill, 267 people. Again, this is voting, but you can imagine it's probably a pretty decent amount of members probably voted on this because of the weight of the issue. St. John UMC, Turnersville, 65 ballots. Sicklerville UMC, 56 ballots. Elmer UMC, 26 ballots. Yes. So that gives you kind of like a little bit of idea. The conference did not bulk it out like this would be X percentage, but that gives you an idea. You know, it's not like, yeah, they are all over the place.
The 2 of them are very large.
Dick, I see you raising your hand. Yeah.
Are there other churches that are still going through the process? No, this was a one-time opportunity. You either made it or you didn't.
Are there, yeah. The question was, are there other churches going through the process? And no, this is, as Pastor Jess said, the deadline has passed at this point. They had to be voted on at this annual conference. I'm just going to repeat some of the questions because I'm remembering that we're recording. I know at least a couple of people expressed an interest. Mary Jane?
So it's only at this annual conference, but next year's annual conference, they can't vote. And the question is, how many churches didn't disaffiliate because of the financial piece?
So the question was, how many churches did not disaffiliate because of the financial piece? I am not, there was probably somewhere in, what I'm gonna say is that we're gonna give you some links for more information because that's kind of one of those things that's gonna be like buried somewhere within the details. After we get through the, kind of the disaffiliation piece, the next thing I'm gonna talk about is where we can get more information. Sure. Okay, so a couple of hopeful things. There have been new opportunities springing up. There is in Central Texas, there were several congregations that had voted to disaffiliate, and that means that a majority of their members were on board with disaffiliating, but in any church, you're probably going to have some people for whom that was not the path that they had wanted to take. So there is a church that has a new church plant called Revive UMC of Central Texas, and that was started under the guidance of Reverend Jen and Todd Pick, And what they did was worked several of these folks from these congregations who had wanted to stay UMC. There's like this hashtag, I think, hashtag BUMC, and they found one another and created a new church so that there was a home for the people who felt like they weren't comfortable in their old home. And you're seeing that in on both. I think it's safe to say on both sides of the fence. There are churches that are in the process of saying, you can find a home with us, whether you are a more traditional person and your congregation has become more inclusive, or whether you are more inclusive in your thinking and your church voted to disaffiliate. So there are churches that are designated as lighthouse churches, oasis churches. These different Methodist churches have taken on these different flavors and labels so that people who did need to find a new church home are able to do that. So there have been new churches springing up. There have been folks who have said, like, you can find a home with us. That does not mean that there hasn't been a lot of heartache. It does not mean that it's cost a lot of money. It does not mean that this is by any means over and done with. When General Conference meets in 2024, you guys are going to see a lot of really divisive headlines. I encourage you to stay focused on the good things that are going on in our church. We're Methodist, we're part of a denomination, but we have so much good stuff going on. So try not to get too distracted by all the things that are going to happen next year. That's just like looking forward for a moment. I am going to say how to get some more information, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A, and then if Pastor Jess wants to talk any more about where do we go from here, actually one of the big things is General Conference next year. But there are lots of true and false articles out there, or nobody comes into this without any context or bias, right? We're all going to interpret this. Like I'm interpreting everything through I call it my Beth lens. And so we're all going to look at this in a different way. So some of the articles also do a better job than others at trying to be impartial. So I'm just going to give you a couple of official places to get information from. I can send anybody who wants this. We can send it, and maybe we can add some links to the bottom of the midweek news or something, so that because you guys don't want to be writing down 55 letters for URLs and stuff like that. But just overview. One of the places is just our very own conference, and if you've never gone to our conference website, it's the Greater New Jersey Conference, and I'm going to tell you, but don't worry about writing it down. It's gnjumc.org. We will send you that. They have information specifically on the 2023 annual conference. You may have read the recap that went out in the email. We're going to do something I think is in the June issue, although I don't know, press time, I can't remember how we handled that. So lots of ways to find out more. You can actually watch, if you've got 16 hours to kill, you can watch the live stream of the entire conference. I personally wouldn't recommend it. Take that out of the recording. We really tried to give you a pretty complete picture of what's going on, and like I said, you can go on the GNJ website and find out more. The conference also puts out a digest, and you can sign up for the digest. I believe it comes out weekly. We'll put that link also in the midweek news. Again, if you're interested in learning more about what's going on in the conference. And then the denomination itself has something called the News Service. So you can find out bigger picture, more denomination-wide news that way. So we'll put all of that out there. I see a stat that I forgot to share with you, total disaffiliations in the United States, 3933. That's not, I mean, it tells you there's a lot of churches that left, but unfortunately for context, a fraction of our 30,000 churches in the US. So that's like 39, 33 out of 3,000. Who's the math people? Between 10 and 15%, yeah. I was gonna say more than 10, a little more than 10, doing a very short, very high level math. So those are some places you can get more info. You can also, like Pastor Jess and I can both, and Pastor Jess, you can tell, has like really deep bench when it comes to information on what's going on, which is why we let her handle most of this, because she, like, I know this much, and she knows like this much. So I'm gonna open up to questions, and I'll sit over here, but probably Jess is gonna end up fielding in most of them. Thank you.
Any questions?
I'm not as articulate as you,
You're fine.
but I had heard when this all came down, it was my understanding when this happened, it was driven by many of the African churches. If it had been left to, say, just the American churches, we would have the Methodist Church would have accepted LGBT changes. I have also heard that there's a group driving some very conservative positions on LGBTQ in certain countries within Africa that's being driven by a non-African woman in the name of Jesus. Can you address if you expect that things will change at the next conference?
Okay, you've got a couple of different questions there. So, we are a global church. We started out as a U.S. church. We were created as a denomination at the same time as our nation was being formed, which is why so many pieces of our denominational structure mirror we have a constitution, we have the three-tiered checks and balances system, we have the legislative, oh my goodness, so many different aspects mirror because it was happening at the same time. The outside of the U.S. churches were started as missionary churches, missionary conferences, missionary this and that. And then once they grew beyond the size of a missionary church, conference, whatever, then they became their own annual conference, and we needed to figure out how to shift our denominational structure to make space for them. So instead of being missionary conferences, at some point in the discipline, they were shifted over to being called the central conferences. So now each central conference is essentially a regional conference. In the US, there are essentially 5 regions. They're called jurisdictional conferences. There's the Northeast, Southeast, North Central, South Central, and Western jurisdictions. What happens at each of these conference levels, we appoint bishops, we send bishops and decide which bishop will go to which jurisdiction or which annual conference, and we draw the boundaries of the annual conferences. In the US, that is, other than missional work, that is the main work of the jurisdictional conference that meets every 4 years. There is no other power about, changing the discipline or anything like that. The only place that we in the US have any authority to do that is at General Conference, which is the worldwide global gathering every 4 years. In the central conferences, because they are, if you read the Book of Discipline, it is very US-centric. very US centric because it was created in the US for a US church that had missionary conferences. And some things have been adapted, but it still is that US centric structure of the way the Board of Trustees have to form themselves legally and the way they're legally bounded. And there's so many different things that are very, very US. So when central conferences meet in their regional conference structure, they do have an opportunity to make changes to their book of discipline and make it culturally relevant and specific in some areas, not all areas, but in some ministry-based areas. Now, the reason why I'm going over any of this is because you asked about the African votes. The central conferences are by majority more conservative than we are in the US. Does that mean that they swung the vote to their more conservative side intentionally and to be harmful to the United Methodist Church as a whole? No, they believe they were being faithful. What's interesting about the US-centric structure and the regionalization cultural adaptation possibility for central conferences, we are not allowed that same freedom in the US. So if a decision is made at general conference that does not suit the culture of the US, too bad. We're stuck with it. But if that same thing happens in a central conference, they can go home and make that necessary shift. It is still structured as a missionary type of a relationship as far as that goes. So there are, especially now that the majority, it's actually pretty similar majority minority in the US and outside the US as a total. The Methodist Church is growing like crazy in Africa and in the Philippines and in Korea. Like it's big in other places to the point where, and it's shrinking in the US. So the US votes are about the same, if not probably a little less now than the Central Conference portion. So while we might, in the past, it was essentially still the US majority in the US, but it's not anymore. So they're trying to restructure. There's a variety, for years, they've been trying to restructure the way we are regionalized. So it's not so US-centric. So that either the US is its own central conference, or maybe there's 5 central conferences within the US. Those jurisdictions would then have the same power to regionalize different things. But then you get into the question of how many books of discipline are we going to have? Is there going to be one central book of discipline that covers X, and then the regionalization ones that cover Y, Z, and Q? You know, it's a messy when you start to look at, you know, what gets decided on a global level and what gets decided on a regional level. So they're working on all of that. With all of that in mind, I would not say the African vote swung it to a more conservative. I would say we live in a global, and we are part of a global denomination that don't all have the same cultural realities. The second question you asked, that was a very long answer. Second question will be shorter, I promise. You asked if there are people essentially swaying votes in the African countries. I would pull that back to there are caucus groups, if you want to call it that, both on both sides. So you've got progressively leaning caucus groups, and you've got conservative leaning caucus groups. The conservative-leaning caucus groups have shifted names over the course of the past 20 years. They used to be called Good News, and then they shifted and they were called the Wesleyan Covenant Association. And now that group, they're not using that name very much because they are the ones who've come up with the new denominational name, which is the Global Methodist Church. I'm curious how the car company GMC feels about that. Sorry. So whether it's Good News, WCA, Wesleyan Covenant Association, or GMC, they're sort of all synonymous for the conservatively leaning traditional push. Now, there's an organization called IDR, Institute for I forget the name of it. It is highly funded by the Koch brothers, among others. Not Coca-Cola Coke, but K-O, that one. There is a lot of money being poured into the traditionalist, that the progressive side just does not have that financial base at all. So that heavily financially backed traditionalist push has had influence in general conferences. They have catered to the more traditional country votes like Africa, and they have used them. They've bought them cell phones and then texted them what their vote should be, because it takes a while for things to translate. So we'll give you the answer, or we'll give you what you should vote while you're waiting for them to translate it. Or they've put them up in like uber awesome hotels, and like they've given them, they've essentially bought their vote in some ways. So has there been swaying of votes? Yes.
Then what are we to do? We're breaking the law, the Methodist law, by saying, well, we're not going to enforce those teeth. We're representing ourselves to Americans, to our local people, as people who are.
Yeah. So what are we to do? I would say personally, y'all know me. My family has taught me to be faithful and inclusive. I mean, I did that Bible study. It's very much where my heart is. I believe that God does love all and calls us to include. And so that's where I am. I don't leave because it's not like people are going to stop realizing they're gay. People are going to continue to be born into our communities, into our churches, even as the Global Methodist Church leaves. Their people are going to have gay kids, and it's just going to circle back again. I stay and I continue to fight for inclusion and justice as I feel God is calling me to. Because if all the progressive voices leave, then that's just less people fighting for inclusion and God's love to be known in the church. So what can we do? Stay hopeful, stay positive, work for the regionalization plan to be adopted in whatever form it ends up being, and continue to be a positive voice.
Go along with sort of what you say. You change things from within. You know, we have a gazebo in the back because Peter stayed in Boy Scouts through all of that. You change things from within by doing what is right and what is just, and otherwise, we'd all leave every 4 to 8 to 12 years when government changes, right? If it's not my president, it's not my person. No, we just need to continue to just be and change it from within. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So as the GMC begins, will it be possible that our book of discipline will eliminate that thing that says that we don't have a Christian teaching?
So will the Book of Discipline change after GMC is formed and created? So eventually. So at the 2019 General Conference, when the teeth were added to the Book of Discipline, all of that was added to the Book of Discipline. It's part of our Book of Discipline, even as the World Council Church people leave. No, Global Methodist Church leaves. It will need to be, those pieces that are not wanted will need to be excised, and changes will need to be made. It's not just like it'll disappear by itself. It will have to be edited. So at the next General Conference, which is next year, 2024, there will be a lot of debate. It'll be ugly, because who asked the question about how many stayed because they couldn't afford to leave? There are still, it's still a big tent church, right? Like, it's not, all of a sudden we live in a open and affirming United Methodist Church just because some GMC churches left. No, we are still a big tent UMC church with a variety of people and beliefs in a global system. We need to figure out how to move forward together. Is it going to be easy? No, it'll be messy. And there's work to do. So, any other? Yes. You need it not for us here, but we are recording this for those who want to watch it later.
Okay. My name's Ed Davis, and my question is, did the Methodist Church as a whole have a plan before we started into this activity? And if I, as an individual, want to go to a traditional Methodist church, could you tell me where to go?
Did we have a plan before we started into any of this? Not really. That's what 2019 General Conference was trying to do. They were trying to end discussion and end debate on human sexuality for good. There were 3 different plans that were proposed. The one that many people thought would be adopted was called the One Church Plan, where every pastor, so if somebody comes to me, I do not have to agree to marry them. If a couple says, can you marry us? And I'm uncertain about the health of that marriage, or if I think there's abuse going on or something, I do not have to say yes. That is my clergy right. You can apply that to LGBTQ. If a clergy person does not feel that it is in their belief system to preside over a same-sex union, the argument with the One Church Plan was, let the pastors decide. If they're comfortable doing it, let them do it, but don't keep them from doing something they believe is faithful. So that was part of the One Church Plan. The other piece was allow the annual conferences to choose whether they're comfortable ordaining an LGBTQ individual, and allow the churches to say, yes, I would be comfortable with receiving an LGBTQ clergy person, or no, that's not where our church is theologically, please don't for the sake of the clergy person and the congregation. It just would not be a good fit. They already do ask some of those theological questions at the appointment time. So the One Church plan had this essentially regionalization built into it that did not pass. The traditional plan passed instead. So we are here in this place of disaffiliation because of the traditional plan passing. So was there a plan? We were trying to move toward one. We are in a place where we need to figure it out now. If you want to attend a church that is more traditional, can I right now tell you one? Probably. But what we could do is get a list from the conference to say which ones are where on the theological spectrum, because that information is asked. Right, so that information is asked every year at church conference season, where the SPRC, the Staff Parish Relations Committee, says this is where the congregation is theologically, so that the pastors that are matched up with that church don't sit on opposite sides of the theological spectrum, and then that's just not healthy for anyone within the church or for the clergy person. So they try to match it up as best as possible. Is it always ideal and always perfect? No. And there are larger tent churches where there's the spectrum of belief. And that's where I'd say this church is progressively, I would say it is welcoming. We're working on the inclusivity piece, but there are people who are struggling with it. And I think we saw that in the straw poll. Is that fair statement? Ish? Okay. Seeing the time, it is 12:40. Is there one more question, or are we? I want to be respectful of people's time. Okay. Yes.
I want to say thank you for explaining a number of complex issues very effectively. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It is complicated. It's complicated. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Beth for being our lay member to annual conference. It is a fun. No, it is. There's some heavy conversations that happen there, but it is also joy-filled and spirit-filled work. So thank you, and thank you all. God bless you. Can I pray for us? God, we give you thanks for the way you move in and through us, the way you fill our church with your Holy Spirit presence. We ask you to continue to inspire us and guide us as your church, your body of Christ. Help us to be faithful. Help us to be loving and always growing in our service to you and others. Be with our church as a whole denomination and guide us in your continued work. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you all. God bless.